JSP Actions are special tags which provides some special features, and the container or the servlet engine handles these tags in a special way. Why do we need these special tags in my JSP? Because this addresses certain common functionalities, right? So we know that in any application there would be certain set of common functionalities in each and every JSP in your page, right? And different people have different mechanisms of coding, so different people code in different ways, right? And when we have certain set of common functionalities in every page, what we'll end up having is different people try to write code in different ways. So we'll have a bunch of logic in your scriptlets, and different people write different logic in there for the same functionality, right? And in this case, the JSP page is going to become more and more complex to debug and maintain at a later point of time, right? So in order to achieve a standard functionality, we have certain set of standard rules which we can follow so that we achieve functionality with less code and a more standard way, right? So what are the different JSP actions we have? So these are some of the JSP actions, some of the most widely used and frequently used JSP actions, right? The JSP Include, JSP Forward, JSP param. useBean is one of the most important in all the JSP actions, which you would be using probably on almost all the JSP pages, right? We have got setProperty and getProperty, right, which are with JSP Include action is as simple as its name suggests. It simply includes a given JSP or HTML page in your main JSP page at the given location in the main page where you specify, right? So let's say that I have my main JSP page where I have some code out here, right, and in between I am including a JSP page. I'm including another JSP page in my main page using the JSP Include action, and this is the syntax for the include action. JSP Include page is whatever page I want to include, and flash is equal to true. That means I'm saying get all the data from the included JSP page to my main page and show it there. And I might have some other code as well after this included action, right? So here what I am simply doing is I'm including the contents of another JSP page in my main JSP page at a given location, right? It's as simple as that. So you would have heard of a similar concept earlier in this session, right? And if you remember quite well, it is during JSP directives. When we discussed JSP directives, we said that we could include a page in my main page. And where you would usually use this feature, probably you can say when you have certain sort of common features in every JSP page, like a header or a footer, you can use those kind of things to include in your main JSP page. So every page basically has the same header or footer, right? Right. So but what's the difference between JSP Include directive and include action, and when should you use directives and when should you use action? So let's just have a look at the differences between these two things. The first and the main thing is that the include directive is done at translation time. So basically the page which is included to your main JSP page at translation time. Okay, so that means whenever your JSP is translated to an servlet, at that point of time even the included JSP page's contents is got into the main JSP page, and then it is translated to a servlet, right? But whereas when it comes to include action, it is not done at translation time but done at runtime. So even though your JSP is translated to a servlet, it doesn't really contain the included JSP contents in the main page, right? But it gets the content at runtime when you execute that page. Okay, right. So most of the other differences are also based on this main difference between the include directive and action, right? So this copies the included file. So as I said, Because it's done at translation time, it simply copies all the contents from your included page to your main page and it does the translation. Whereas in include action, it references to the include file, right? So since we didn't do it at translation time, it simply keeps the included page at its own path, and it has some kind of link or reference in the main page where it points to this included page, and it grabs this content from the included page at runtime and then populates that, right? So as we know that since the include directive is including the subpage at translation time itself, this is more likely to be used for static contents. Why? Because let's say for example that your subpage has changed, okay, and but your main page hasn't changed, okay, and if you go and try to view this main page again, you won't see the latest changes made in your subpage. Why? Because the static content, the included page content, was included into your main page at translation time, and translation happens only once, and it happens at the first time, and it again happens whenever you make any changes to your main page, right? So since you didn't make any changes to your main page, no translation happens again. So that means that the same old static content is present in your main page. The same static content of the included page is present in your main page, and not the new changes which you just did it, right? But whereas in include action, since it gets the contents of the included page at runtime, you can use it for dynamic content, right? So that means, let's say that your included page is being modified frequently. It's used in a lot of pages, but again it's being modified frequently, right? So in that case you can go for dynamic content, because you don't have to really compile and change your main page so that your included pages new content can be reflected, right? So that's the major differentiator between directive and action. And the last thing, you cannot pass parameters to the include directive, whereas you can pass any parameters to the include action element tag, right? So that's the basic difference between the include directive and include action. The next thing is in forward, JSP forward action. So this again is similar to JSP include. It forwards the request to a given page. When you say JSP include, your included JSP page's contents is put in your main JSP page, and your main JSP page is displayed. But here it doesn't include any contents of the included page, but it simply forwards the request to the given page, right? So that means that whatever content you had on your main JSP page would not be forwarded to the subpage. So let's say that you had something written on your main JSP page, right? Some in HTML tags, and you put something in your main JSP page, and ultimately you did a forward to a forwarded page, right? So whatever content you had in your main JSP page will not be passed over to the forward JSP page, right? So that's one thing you have to make a note of. And I think you rarely use this JSP forward in your application, right? So this is the syntax for JSP forward. JSP forward page, whatever page you want to forward this request to, right? Now we've seen JSP include and JSP forward, right? And even in JSP include, we said that we can pass parameters to JSP include, but we couldn't pass parameters to JSP directive. And so how do you pass parameters to these two elements, JSP include and actions? I'm sorry, JSP include and forward, using the JSP param action element, right? So this is used to pass parameters to the included or forwarded page, and this is the syntax for JSP param. So let's say that I want to include a page, but the contents of the page is again it depends on certain values which comes from the main page, right? So let's say that in my included JSP page, in my footer page, I want to display things like page 1 of 4 or page 2 of 4, something like that. So I pass that value of the number of page using the JSP param. So I pass page number in the parameter name, and I pass 1, 2, 3 in the value, right? So this way I can have certain kind of dynamic content based on the page which is actually including my sub page in my included JSP page, right? So it's not really completely static in nature, but it can also have certain dependencies on my main page which is actually including this page, right? So similarly with JSP Forward as well, you can have the JSP param action which will allow you to pass parameters to the forwarded page and make use of that or display that parameter on the included or forwarded page, right? Okay, so one of the most important and probably the most widely used JSP action is the JSP useBean, right? So let's see what this JSP useBean is. So let's say that you have a web application, and as soon as the user logs in, the request goes to the servlet, okay, the user servlet, whatever, okay, and we know that a bean is nothing but a set of getters and setter methods which identifies the state of an object, okay. So let's say that this is a user bean which has ID and name stored in this bean. So I have getters and setters for ID and name. So this is nothing but user ID and username, okay. So whenever a user logs into a system, this servlet invokes this user bean, and it sets the values of the ID and name to whatever the user has entered on the login screen, right? Now when this request is passed to a JSP page, ultimately I want to pass this username and ID to this JSP page so that it can be displayed on the JSP page. How can I do it? Right? How can this JSP page use this bean values which is set at the servlet? We know that we have different scopes, the request, session, application, right? And we know that we can set attribute values to that scope as well, right? So one thing I could do is I could simply say request dot set attribute username is equal to whatever username, and request dot set attribute ID is equal to whatever ID, and pass those two request attributes R1 or whatever, R1, R2 to the JSP page, and display those values on the JSP page using request.getAttributes methods, right? So this, if it's a small application like this where I just have to get two values and print those two values on my JSP page, I could pretty much use the request attribute and do something like that. But let's say that I have 10 values which needs to be passed from my request to, from my servlet to the JSP. So am I going to write 10 different request or set attribute statements to put 10 different attributes? No, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bean and set all the values in the bean, and I'm going to pass that bean to the JSP page, right? So I'm going to say request.setAttribute user bean, and I'm going to set this bean value in my user bean attribute, and I'm going to pass that to the JSP page, and I can now fetch the values of the ID and name from the user bean in my JSP page, right? So in my servlet I say request.setAttribute user bean and set the value of this user bean, where I set the ID and name from whatever the user had entered on the login screen, right? And on the JSP page, how do I retrieve the value of that user bean? How can I get the value of ID and name, right? I can use the JSP useBean action to get the values of the user bean object, right? Okay, so let's see the syntax of the JSP useBean action now. We've just discussed that when you have a bean in your servlet and you set some properties to that bean in your servlet and you want to same property values to be read in the JSP page, you can do that using the JSP useBean action. But in actuality, the JSP useBean action is not used to retrieve values of the bean class, right? The properties of the bean. In fact, we have different JSP methods, actions for that, but what's the purpose of JSP useBean is to instantiate the bean class. Okay, so we know that when you are coding in servlets or Java, when you want to use values of a particular object, you first need to create a reference of that object. So let's say I have to use the values of bean class. I need to create a reference saying userBean u is equal to new userBean, or assign it to whatever reference you have if you already have one, right? So first I'm creating a reference ub for my userBean class, and only then I can use the methods of that userBean class, saying get id or get name or whatever, right? In a similar manner, there has to be certain reference which you need to create in your JSP as well. So if you want to use the userBean object with the values which we have set, we need to have certain reference so that you can call methods on that userBean and retrieve the values, right? So this actually instantiates the bean class and creates a reference for you, right? And this is a syntax for the userBean action. So you say userBean id is equal to bean instance name. So in this previous example, we set an attribute with name userBean, and we set the userBean object to that. So whatever attribute name we have here, we need to provide the same name in this id attribute for the userBean action element, right? And we know that we have one of the four scopes: page, request, session, and application, which we already discussed in the previous videos. So you need to give one of the four scopes, and in this example we set the userBean attribute at the request scope. So the scope here would be request and the ID would be userBean. Now what is class? Class is nothing but the class, object class. So this bean, let's say it's userBean ubean, would be the class here. So since I am assigning the userBean, which is of type ubean class, the class would be here whatever com.sharmunch.ubean, something like that, right? And what does type mean? Type is nothing but the reference type. So so it's really tricky because you can have a different type of class, you can have a different class name in the class, and you can have a different class name in type as well, because you know that you can create an instance of a subclass. Let's say employee is a subclass and a person is a superclass, because employee is a person, right? So employee is a subclass and a person is a superclass. So basically what you can do is when you say employee emp person p is equal to new employee, you can do something like that, right? Here employee is nothing but the class, but whereas type is nothing but person, right? So you can have a different class, and you can have a different object type, and you can have a different reference type as well. So this is something like that. The class is nothing but the object type, and the type is nothing but the reference type. Okay, and you have the bean name. So this is the basic syntax of userBean action, which instantiates the userBean class. So when you actually put this in your JSP page, it basically tries to find a bean with this name, with this attribute value, which in that particular scope which is set. So in this particular example, it's going to search for a request scope if you have set any attribute with the userBean name. But again, if it hadn't found any attribute set with this attribute name in the given scope, what it's going to do is it's simply going to create a new bean with that name for you, right? So now we know how to instantiate a bean in your JSP page, but how do you really use the values, the properties of those bean in your JSP page. You can do that using the JSP getProperty action element, right? So this basically gets the property values of a bean, and this is the syntax for JSP getProperty. JSP getProperty name is equal to bean instance name. So basically whatever value you put in the ID attribute for the JSP useBean element would go in the name for the JSP getProperty element, right? So here you are basically saying that you want to you want to get the property values for this particular bean, right? And in property you basically give whatever property name, whatever value you want to fetch. So in this example it could be username which you want to fetch and display on the JSP page. So the property would be username here, right? So in a similar manner, there could be a need where I want to set the property values in my JSP page again, so that I can use this bean again, the property values in this bean at some other place later point of time. How can I do that? I can do that using the JSP setProperty method. So similar to JSP getProperty, this sets the property values in a bean, and basically the getProperty and setProperty actions are used in conjunction with the JSP useBean action. So whenever you use the JSP useBean, you have the getProperty or setProperty actions, right? It can't exist by its own. Okay. So the syntax is similar to JSP getProperty. You have JSP getProperty, and name would again be the bean instance name, right? And for now let's ignore property is equal to star, and you can either set a value of a single property name. So let's say I want to set a value for username, right? I could say property is equal to username, and value would be whatever value I want to set to the username attribute, right? So now alternatively I can also set a value based on certain input entered in my page, right? So let's say that I have a field for username on my page, right? And I want to update that value, whatever value was entered in that field for username, to this property in this user bean, right? So how can I do that? I can basically map that to the param. So here this JSP setProperty element also has a param attribute, and I can simply map that field name where I want to, which would be updated by the user, to this param attribute. Right, so in this case whatever value is entered in that username input text box would be updated to this bean for that particular property. So if I say username here, it would be updated to the username property, right? So now what the star does is, if I put a star here, it means that basically for all the property values in my bean, simply map all parameters with the same name. So let's say that I have two properties in my bean, that is ID, user ID and username, and similarly I have two parameters, two input fields, input boxes in my JSPs. One is username and the other is user ID. So here the catch is you should have the same name in the input field for the input field, so that it matches the input field name with the property name. So if I have properties as username and user ID, my input text box names should also be username and user ID, so that this can automatically map these values to that input fields and update the value of the bean with whatever values you have entered in those input fields, right? So that's how you can use the star version of the property attribute. So basically you can use the JSP setProperty element inside the JSP useBean body and outside the JSP useBean body as well. So what's the difference between using it inside and outside? So when you use it outside the JSP useBean body, it automatically sets the value of that particular property to the value which you set, irrespective of what value it was earlier when it was brought over from the servlet, right? So let's say that I set the value of user ID to 1 in servlet, and I pass that to the JSP page, and in the JSP useBean action, it instantiates the useBean and the value of ID is brought in as 1, and suddenly in my page I again do a JSP set property and I say user ID is equal to 2 now, so it simply sets the value to 2 now and it changes the value whatever was bought in. But if I use this JSP set property inside my JSP useBean body, it will change the value, or basically it will set the value of that property only when the user bean was not found. So we said earlier that with this useBean action, if there is already a bean with this name instantiated, it simply gets the reference to that. But if it doesn't find anything, it's going to create a new object and it's going to instantiate that bean class. So if you use the set property within the bean class, it sets the property value only if it didn't find the bean class, right, and it instantiated the bean class in the JSP, right. Otherwise it wouldn't set the value of that property to the new value. It simply is going to retain whatever it is bought in from the servlet, right. So this is a simple example of the JSP useBean with set and get properties. So as I just discussed earlier, here we are using the set property action within the body of the useBean, JSP useBean. So here you see that whatever ID I have specified in the JSP useBean element is used as name in the set property and get property actions, right. So this is about the JSP actions in brief.